Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job, and we help you level up so you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter. And today we're going to be talking about best practices for using forms. So pretty much every web app out there has some form built into it where users can fill out data and then submit it to some server for some sort of processing. Juan and I have been working with forms for a very long time. And today we're just going to kind of go back and forth on some of our best practices that we would like to talk about. So Juan, why don't you kick it off? What's one of your top tips for using forms?
Yeah, so when you're designing forms, there's many aspects that come to it. One is technical, right? Like the structural document that you create, the tags, the different things that go around the form, accessibility. But there's also the design aspect to the form. And by this, I don't mean like the looks or the styles, the colors, but more like the actual form design. There's a whole like set of best practices around this. So the first one that I think is very fundamental to forms is that never ask for more information than that the info that you need. For example, imagine I'm collecting data for my users and I need some information from them. Let's say I need the name and then I need maybe just an email and a password. Let's say we're creating an account. But if you start adding form fields and when you put all of them required and you put first name, last name, age, email, state, zip code, right? When you add more information and you ask for more information that you actually need, that's actually bad, and most likely users won't fill that out because they're going to start wondering, why are you asking for this information? I just need an account, username and password. You shouldn't even need my age, my name, or my zip code, right? Unless you're going to ship something. So always be mindful of the information you're asking and always collect the minimum amount of data you can, and you will have a higher success rate, right? Like when users will fill out your form. So really like the best practice is that when it comes to form, less fields is more.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful tip, one. I don't know if I've ever thought of that in detail too much myself, but yeah, that's a great point, especially from data uh, privacy perspective for your customers. That's a great one.
Yeah.
All right, so a tip I have for anyone to be able to use inside of their forms is if you've ever created the input element in your form, which of course you have if you are building a form, it, make sure that you're always using the label element as well. So if you've never heard of the label element, it can be paired with an input element in order to help a couple of things. One of them is accessibility for both people with disabilities visually to be able to select the correct field. So for example, normally you have to perfectly click into the input. And for an input text box, that's not so bad. But if you have to like click little radio buttons, it can be really difficult for a lot of people to click precisely in there. But if you use a label element, and there's a couple ways you can do either you can have it separated and using an ID and a for attribute to link them together, or you can wrap your inputs inside of your label elements. And this will add a level of accessibility to your website.
Yeah, and that I believe has some impact also with screen readers. So you don't have to use area label tags since you are relying on semantic HTML. So it's actually a very good practice to always have labels. So that's pretty good, Jared.
All right,
So
Juan, what's your next tip?
yeah, so the next one, continuing with like this, creating forms is easy, right? Creating good forms is hard, or designing them. So continuing with the design, something that is very like classic is that, you have forms and there's different ways to organize it, right? One way is, for example, you just have single column forms, and another way is that you have multiple column forms. So avoid creating forms that span out through multiple columns. And the reason for that is because when the user is filling out the information and is going down and then has to go to the right and up again, right? And if there is some sort of scrolling, they complicate things. And the thing is that you don't know what size of screen they're using. Maybe they're on a smaller computer, an iPad, maybe a phone, and maybe your site is not responsive. So it's really better, or a best practice for forms, to just have single column forms whenever possible, right? So keep that in mind, and it makes it easy to fill things out because they go from top to bottom. And then for responsiveness, it's easy because the responsive version, the mobile version of the form, is just exactly the same what they see in the bigger screen. So that's a good practice, and you will increase your fill out rate if you're doing something like a survey, or you are collecting information, or you are creating a sign up form, right? So it will make it easy because users will have an easier time navigating.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And it simplifies design as well. Like you're saying, if you just have it all in one line there, the responsiveness almost is built in a way. So no, that's a great one. My next couple of tips here have to do with validation. Okay, so we've talked about this before in other episodes of the podcast. There's front end validation and back end validation, and we're just going to be focusing on front end validation today. But there's a few different tools that are made available to you just kind of out of the box that you don't have to do very much work for. So on an input element, you can actually add your own set of validation on them. For example, you can have a required attribute. If it's a string text input box, you can set minimum or maximum lengths on it. For a number field, you could set certain values on it. And what's nice about this is that when you go to submit a form, this is built into the browser. I call this HTML5 validation. You just click submit, and little boxes localized to whatever language you have will pop up informing the user. Now, these aren't always the prettiest boxes in the world, but for an out-of-the-box validation for a website that you're building, right, you can have this level of validation without adding a bunch of layers of your own custom JavaScript or frameworks or things like that to it. So that would be a thing I would suggest doing. If you've never looked at HTML form validation, take a look at some of the attributes that you can use.
That's really good, and it simplifies things because you can just use native HTML, and you don't have to even use JavaScript, and you already have out of the box native HTML5 validation. So it's very powerful, especially the email validation, because doing JavaScript validation for emails, there's always like these edge cases when you don't get it quite right. So it's just better leave it to the browser and to the vendor, right, that implements that browser. So that's really good. Good tip, Jared. So continuing with validation, now that you mention it, something that is like always upsetting to customers, to users, is that informing about errors. When you're filling out a form, chances are that you're collecting user input, right? So that means that anything the user enters, right, that's something that it's prone to errors. So always communicate errors clearly. There's nothing more frustrating for a user to enter and fill out a form and then click submit, save, sign up, whatever button is the action, and then say something like the form saying something like invalid information, try again, or like it's frustrating. So always the first tip is use inline errors. So show the error along or in line with the field that is supposed to be corrected. That's the number one. Number two, don't wait for the user to click submit to be notified about the error. Let's say I submit a form, I fill out 10 fields, all of them are wrong, and then I click submit. It's frustrating to see that all of them are filled out incorrectly, right? When you show the inline errors just there. No, just do it as they type things out. Let's say I type an email and it's wrong, show right away the inline error there. This email is incorrect. This email is already taken. Don't wait for them to submit. That will increase the experience. Also, make sure you made it very clear what fields are optional. Don't just like let the user to guess, because sometimes if the fields are optional, the users are just going to skip it. But that's better. You don't want to collect so many attributes, so many items. And the other thing is like it goes with the first tip I shared. Less is more. Okay, so just maybe you have a lot of optional fields. Maybe just remove them, collect them at some other time, maybe at some other step. So keep that in mind. But inline clear errors are key for successful, for really mastering how to build good web HTML forms. So what is your experience, Jared, with like errors and validation and like messages?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Juan, in providing that, error handling right in line. You can add a red border around input boxes that are incorrect. One important thing to go along with this is that, so by default, and this kind of goes into another tip, is when you're building modern forms, generally speaking, you're not going to be sending this data via the standard like post method that you can place on the actual form. Generally speaking, you're going to have it submit, call some sort of JavaScript function, and then call some sort of RESTful endpoint these days, typically speaking. And when you do that, it's important to have that event.prevent default, which is going to prevent the form from submitting in that automatic way. Because I think an experience we've all had before is we fill a whole form out, we click submit, and then it sends back a response saying, hey, something's wrong, some data is incorrect. And then it clears out the form, right? And then we have to fill the form out again. So
Yeah.
preventing default will go a long way to preventing that type of behavior. There are some times where you might need to specifically keep track of that state and reload it. But again, that might take some specific use case there. But yeah, no, I think those are really great points on that when it comes to validation and understanding that. One other bit would be going along with this validation. Let's say you do have all that HTML5 validation, those attributes on there. And also, one little bit is one great way to trigger when a user is finished typing, right? So for example, let's say they're typing in their email. Well, you might not want to yell at them with an error message right as they start typing. Well, you can tap into what's called the on blur event to be able to know when the user has clicked away from a field. And that would be an appropriate time to run a validation and then communicate to the user of what's going on or what they did wrong. But beyond that, there's times where when you ultimately do click submit, you're going to have to run some of your own custom JavaScript validation and potentially communicate to the user with some sort of pop-up. So one example of this is there's no HTML5 validation attribute, as far as I know, that says two fields have to match. So very common cases when you're creating an account and there's a password and a confirm password, you would want these to match. You want to check this validation client side before you even send it to the server. You don't need to send it all the way to the server if you can just check that. And from my experience, you have to do that in JavaScript on the submission before it actually goes to the server. But what's your take on that one?
Yeah. So when it comes to, like, for example, for those cases, there's like you want to make sure that for example, specifically to password. For example, I was just thinking about the password where you were saying the example. Like, one good practices that comes to passwords is that in 2021 is that instead of asking for confirmed password, just have a single input for the password and allow the user to see the password. Maybe you have seen these like show password or reveal password, because that's going to make it easier. It's going to be a better experience, especially now that the traffic is mobile, a lot of mobile users. So it makes it easy, because when you have to type a mobile password twice, sometimes you're going to make mistakes. There's auto correction, there's auto capital. It's kind of hard to know what you're doing wrong, and it can be really frustrating. So that's kind of like what it comes to mind when it comes to like that password matching. But that's a good tip. So thinking about like the validation, like continuing with that, always make sure to share clear messages. Like, like humans are filling out your form. So don't use weird messages. For example, let's say I filled out the email and says invalid input. Like, that's not very human-like, human-friendly, right? So always provide examples if there is an error. For example, if you're expecting, and this has happened to me a lot with many forms, that you fill out, let's say, I don't know, a phone number, and it says like invalid phone number. And like, okay, why? And maybe they expect a specific format. So provide examples. Okay. So that's one good practice there. Another one is just use one single input for each field you want to capture. So for example, you have seen like phone numbers, and sometimes you see forms that have like three fields, right? Three fields that are separate. You start typing, let's say, the phone number, right? Let's say 415, and it doesn't auto move, right? Or then you have to click the other field and fill the other four digits. So if you split it out into multiple ones, that's a bad experience for the user. And it's also going to be harder for you to capture that phone number. So always use one field per data attribute, data point you want to capture. So that those are the two combined tips that I'm sharing now. Jared,
No,
what do you
that's
think
great.
about those?
Yeah, no, I think that those are definitely good points to be made. And going along with that same idea of talking about individual inputs, something that I definitely strongly recommend is to use the native input elements that are provided to you. There's a lot of people out there who want to create, custom input boxes or custom drop-down selectors and things like that. And I think there is a place for those that exist out there. But a lot of the times, using the standard input and select elements can go a really long way. And again, you get a lot of that validation built in. One thing I'd like to point out is that, like, for example, with the select element, you're kind of limited on the styling that you can apply to that drop-down select element. However, there's a lot of mainstream companies like Apple, for example, apple.com, for many of their drop-down select menus, they're just using native drop-down input selects, right? You can right click and inspect and see it right there. And they're doing that for a sense of consistency and user experience across multiple different devices and multiple different screen sizes and compatibilities with different browsers. So I don't think you should ever feel ashamed of being able to use standard input and select elements in your forms, even if maybe they don't look quote unquote the prettiest. Other input fields give you a greater level of control over the styling, but other ones don't. So anyway, that's my experience with that one. But what's your next tip?
Yeah, the next tip, Jared, is that you were mentioning about the clear fields, right? And like when you mentioned, like, you do a submission and the forms clear out, right? And you have to refill out. So when you were mentioning, I was remembering something that is native to HTML that I have still seen in some forms. So, oh, by the way, your video is not working. It froze. So if you want to like reset it. So the practice is that the HTML, there used to be a button, and I think it's button type reset, and that is to clear the form fields, or is to clear everything. And that is about practice, because it's, if a user wants to clear out the form, they will just like abandon the page or not submit it. Okay, so the best practice is avoid using the type reset button or the clear form buttons. Like, nobody wants to fill out something to then clear it. If they want to clear a field, the user will do it. So avoid that, because they accidentally might click it and then clear the information, and then they won't refill it again. So that's the best practice there. And your videos is still not working.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that one. Yeah, I think you need to re-enable my video if you'd like me to do that. So another one of the tips that I had thinking about, yeah, generally, like you were saying, I don't think users are going to want to reset the form on their own anyway, right? I don't think that would make sense for them to do. So a couple of other little bits are, if you ever have, and so this is a behavior I think a lot of people get kind of confused by, and it's not explicit, is that when you have a form element, and anywhere inside of that form element, you have a button, by default, that button is going to be interpreted as a submit button. When that button is clicked, even if that button's meant to do something else, it's going to attempt to submit the form. So it's important that if you are going to have a button in your form for whatever specific use case, that you put an attribute on it of type equals button, and this will make it be treated as not a submit button and just a normal button there.
So what happens when it says submit, Jared? Is that like refreshes the form or tries to like post?
It tries to send the form data as opposed to the server.
So like that's what happens, like the common bug that it refreshes the page, right? Like kind of like, okay, that's good. Yeah, I remember running into that. I mean, it's been a while, but yeah. So another practice, Jared, that is very important is that when we're capturing data from users, form fields, always make sure to have SSL enabled on the site. Have HTTPS, have an SSL certificate. And the reason for this is because whatever we type on a form, if it is not over HTTPS, it's not going to be encrypted. If you're capturing passwords, they're not going to be encrypted. That means that if you have a sign up page, or you have a contact information like contact us, and people type emails and personal information like, hey, I have this, I would like to consult with your company for this and that, and you don't have HTTPS enabled, that is not going to be encrypted. And the thing is like that traffic, that form is going to travel through different points, different servers before it gets to your server and it gets persisted and you get notified. So if it is not encrypted, then you don't know who's going to have access to that. If there is something sensitive there, then it's not really going to be good, right? So always make sure, like as a user, if you're not, if you see that there's no HTTPS, there's no like a green lock or a lock on your browser, maybe don't use that form. Don't fill it out because your information, if it is sensitive, it could be like at risk to be accessed by people that you don't want to like give them access to that. And as a creator, as a webmaster, make sure that you always have HTTPS over your application and your form. I mean, if you have an application where you sign in or something, you have to have HTTPS. I mean, that's like the standard. There's free certificates in 2021 you can get. You can use Firebase. They offer that. I mean, so there's really no excuse. And if you're not using Firebase or you have to buy it, you can buy them for $8 a year. So it's like not really bad. So always make sure you have that because you have to protect the security of your users and their confidentiality and their information, especially if it is sensitive. So passwords, emails, So
Yeah,
that's the
and
the
as
tip when it comes to forms.
yeah, and as I understand it, some browsers will also actually, be aware of, hey, you're about to submit data via, a password field or a credit card field with that's not over HTTPS, right? So if you as a webmaster aren't running HTTPS, then a browser might complain to the user, hey, they're not allowed to send this, right? And that's a bad user experience, and it's going to make your website look bad because you're not handling their security accordingly. My next tip here would be there's a couple of different attributes that I think are very useful that you can also add onto your input fields. So one of them is called a placeholder. And this is a great little bit of text that will basically appear as kind of like this, generally a grayed out text that will be in the input box when the input box is empty. So this can be a nice way to help inform the user of, hey, this is what this might look like. So if it's like a phone number field, right, it could show, the set of three digits, and 4 digits, right? Or if it's a name, right, it could put someone like John or Jane or something like that. So definitely I recommend, looking at placeholders as a way to improve your user experience. And then the other quick attribute I want to add on, just tag on here with this tip, is the disabled attribute. So the disabled attribute will actually cause a form field to be generally grayed out and the user cannot click into it. Juan, are there some examples that you've used of where you've had to have certain fields disabled or
Yeah.
have to maybe toggle them back on
Yeah,
and off?
there's two cases, and something super important that comes with forms is that disabled don't it won't submit the value. So for example, let's say you are showing a username and some sites don't let you change it. Some sites like or some apps like to show it like an input that is disabled and it has a username and saying like you cannot change it. Some others just don't bother and just render it as a div or just as text, right? Which is even better for 2021. But the disabled, like whatever you put there, disabled is gonna be ignored. So it's not gonna be submitted as part of the payload. If you want it to be submitted, you can use the attribute called read only. So read only won't let the user modify it. They won't let it, they won't change it, but it's going to be submitted as part of the payload. So always keep in mind disable and read only, two different use cases. They're both grayed out, but one will submit, one won't submit. But always remember when you're using those, still do backend validation, like not just like grab everything the user posts from the front end, because it's so easy to go inspect the element, remove the disable, change the username. And if you just like grab it and try to change it, right, as part of your request, then you're going to have security vulnerability. So always make sure you sanitize the inputs that you receive in your backend, like whitelist the attributes you are expecting. So if you know that is read only or disable, just ignore those out when you are parsing the payload you're receiving, and then do the process, save it, whatever you're doing there. But make sure, so you always have to do like that front end, back end work, right? Like the front end has to maybe, let's say, do validations and things, but the back end has to redo them. You cannot trust user input. You cannot trust the front end. So that's one thing regarding that. The other thing, Jared, is that you mentioned about the placeholder. Avoid using the placeholder as the label of the input, because there's nothing more annoying that, and this is something like Material has that, but Material like shows a label, like it turns the placeholder into a label, and there's a label. Like you look at the elements and there's an actual label there and everything, and they have like accessibility. But if you're doing it yourself, it sucks because if you have a long form, let's say 10 fields, and you start filling things out, and then you're like, want to change something, but then you just lost the label because the placeholder was replaced with your text. So you don't know what, and that has happened to me. So I have to go and, was it this form? Delete the whole field, then, oh, this is not it. Type it again. This is not it. And then find it. So it's a bad user experience. So don't use placeholders as labels. Still have labels somewhere in the form. So those are two things that come to mind. I'm going to take a break now, Jared, to just remind our audience, like if you're on YouTube, please subscribe. We're publishing content weekly in our channel. If you are in another platform, go to YouTube and follow us there, or follow us in the platform you're on. If you're on Spotify or Apple Cast or whatever 20 platforms we're on, you subscribe there so you're notified about our new content. Now, one more thing, don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Our Twitters are posted in the description of this video or this episode in whatever platform you're on. So yeah, let's remember that. Okay, so Jared, we have 5 minutes left. So let's share a couple more tips. What would be the next tip that you have for our audience today?
Yeah. So the last primary tip I have, and I'll just mention really quick back up to what you were saying. I completely agree about that backend validation and within front end. So I just want to reiterate how critically important it is that you also make sure that your backend validates your data. But yeah, my last tip goes back into to kind of this design idea that we've been talking about in different ways of how would you actually design your form, and again, not from a CSS standpoint, but from like a user experience standpoint. So in the case where, let's say, your web app does need to get perhaps a lot more fields of information from a particular user, one really great way that you can do this is, don't necessarily put it all on one page, right? You can theoretically break it up into kind of multiple stages where you're asking for specific pieces of information on one page, like maybe you're just asking for their first name and last name. And then maybe on another page, if your app does require their address, okay, have them fill out their address on like a secondary page. And I think this can help focus the user's attention on what needs to be done, and only present the information that they need, rather than perhaps being overwhelmed with all this information, asking for all this information. And again, to that point of, if it's a really big form, then that's also going to make some users that are going to step away, be like, nah, I'm not actually interested in filling out all this data. So you can break it up. One quick example out there that you can see in the world is like YouTube. When you go to upload a video on YouTube, the very first step is you drag and drop the file in to upload, and then it takes you to another page where you can start filling out the information while it begins uploading and processing in the background, which is a really nice user experience that you can begin filling out all these details while it's being uploaded and processed. But yeah, that's going to be my last tip for today, Juan. So what are some of your last tips here?
Two tips, like the last tips. The first one is group related information. So for example, like like if you're looking at a long form, it's kind of hard to read, right? So always group like, okay, your information, your shipping address, right? So now there's sections. So that's one thing that's gonna make things easier. And the second thing is like the submit button or the save button, whatever action that will persist that form information. Make sure that it's different than a cancel button, for example, because then it will make it easier for the user to go and save. So probably if you have noticed, like some platforms you visit, like usually e-commerce, for example, Amazon, like you go and you see that the checkout is giant, right? Or the cancel or delete from cart is like this little link, right? And this is intentional. They do it so then it's hard to delete things from the cart. So it's harder to like, I mean, and they don't make it hard. They make it easy, but it's like they're enticing you to purchase, check out, spend the money, right? Like, because that's how they make money. So make sure that you want them to sign up. You want them to submit the information. You want them to contact you. So make sure that that button is different than the other buttons in the page. So that's like the last two tips I have, and maybe one more to finish. Use the appropriate data type that you're, and this relates to what you mentioned about the type email. But for example, let's say if I'm filling out a date, use the type date. So then a calendar will auto-populate and show up there. If you're doing a phone number, you can use a type number or type phone for that. I know there's a type for that. And in mobile keywords, it will make it show a numeric keyword instead of, let's say, phone number in a phone. Let's say you're in a phone and the mobile, you open the site, and then you're going to type the font, it's annoying to see the full QWERTY keyword, right? Because it's annoying to see using numbers. So if you use the appropriate type, it's just going to show the big 0 to 9 digits in the keyword. So it also helps accessibility. Last thing, navigate your keyword, navigate your form with the keyboard. So make sure, try to use your form and fill it out, not using the mouse. See if you can. See if you place tab to navigate between fields and see if it makes sense or if they're going in different order. Maybe your indexes are wrong. There's indexes on the form fields too that you can leverage when you want certain ordering. So make sure that you test that stuff, because there's many people that don't use the mouse, or when they're filling out forms, they're just using the keyboard, and it will help you with your conversions, with your contact rates. And that's really it. So yeah, that's great. We're out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today in this episode of the Bootcamp Live. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
I will see you next week. Thank you.